Living in 2025, the thought of my phone battery dying and losing the ability to instantly check the time fills me with dread. But now picture existing in an era where the phrase, "I'll meet you at 3 o'clock," simply wasn't part of the common vernacular. Medieval individuals possessed a fundamentally different perception of time, a concept that strikes me as simultaneously terrifying and oddly tranquil. Back then, the notion of being stylishly late wasn't really applicable because, well, how could one be tardy when nobody knew the precise hour? The nearest approximation to arranging a meeting would involve phrasing like, "I'll see you when the church bells ring for evening prayer," or suggesting, "Let's convene when your shadow measures the same as your height." It's somewhat akin to informing a friend today, "I'll arrive after my cat concludes her nap." Technically a time frame, but certainly not precise. Despite the absence of exact time measurement, tracking time held considerable importance, particularly for medieval monks who adhered to specific prayer times throughout the day. Merchants also required methods to monitor time for their commercial activities. The lack of precise time measurement gave rise to some rather curious situations. There are actual court documents from medieval England detailing disputes where individuals argued whether a crime occurred before or after the crowing of a rooster. Imagine attempting to present your neighbor's rooster's crow as evidence in a contemporary courtroom. And here's an interesting tidbit. In some medieval towns, the official timekeeper could face fines if they sounded the town bells at the incorrect moment. Talk about a high-stress occupation. However, perhaps the most striking aspect of medieval timekeeping was the relaxed attitude people held towards it. Without the perpetual pressure of exact minutes and seconds ticking by, life progressed at a different rhythm. They weren't burdened by the modern anxiety of, "Oh no, I'm 5 minutes behind schedule." Instead, they lived in sync with the natural cycles and the pulse of their communities. Speaking of nature's rhythms, one of the most dependable ways medieval people monitored time was by observing the sun's journey across the sky, which brings us to one of their rather clever inventions, sundials. While essentially just elaborate implements for indicating time, these devices represented a significant advancement for medieval individuals who had already become adept at tracking the sun's daily passage. The fundamental principle was brilliantly simple. Erect a pole, known as a gnomon, in the ground, and its shadow would shift as the sun traversed overhead. Medieval artisans took this basic concept and expanded upon it, crafting some truly impressive instruments. Granted, they lacked the precision of your smartphone, but they could tell you if it was roughly time for a meal. And let's be honest, isn't that what ultimately matters? Some medieval sundials were constructed with such remarkable precision that they could measure time intervals down to 15 minutes. Not bad for something that is fundamentally a sophisticated stick embedded in the earth. The most common type was the horizontal sundial, typically found in monastery gardens or public squares. But medieval Europeans demonstrated considerable creativity in their designs. They developed vertical sundials affixed to church walls, perfect for those, "Oh no, am I late for Mass?" moments. Portable sundials for traveling merchants, essentially the medieval equivalent of a wristwatch, and even ring dials that could be worn around the neck, serving as ancient time-telling jewelry. Monks in particular were notably dedicated to the accuracy of sundials as their daily routine revolved around specific prayer times. Picture being the monk tasked with explaining to the abbot why everyone missed morning prayers because your sundial calculations were off. "Apologies, abbot, I seem to have misplaced a digit while adjusting for the equinox." That explanation likely wouldn't have been well received in a medieval monastery. However, sundials faced their own limitations. Firstly, they were entirely useless at night, which is rather like owning a phone that only functions when you're standing on one foot and facing north. They were also ineffective on overcast days, a rather frequent occurrence if you're familiar with medieval European weather. In regions like England or northern France, your sundial would be about as helpful as a chocolate teapot during those perpetually gray winter months. Every sundial required precise calibration for its specific geographic location. Relocate a sundial even just 50 miles north or south, and suddenly your scheduled lunch break is occurring at breakfast time. Medieval merchants discovered this the hard way. There are documented cases of individuals complaining about sundials providing inaccurate times after being moved. It's like having to recalibrate your watch every time you visit your grandmother. Some ingenious medieval individuals attempted to address these limitations by creating universal sundials that could be adjusted for different latitudes. These were essentially the Swiss Army knives of medieval timekeeping. Complex, costly, and definitely something you'd proudly display to your neighbors. Oh, this old thing? It's merely my portable, altitude-compensated sundial with seasonal correction factors. No big deal. Medieval Islamic astronomers elevated sundial technology to unprecedented heights. They created sundials capable of indicating not just the time, but also the direction of Mecca for prayers. These advanced designs eventually found their way into European markets, fostering fascinating cultural exchanges in timekeeping technology. The most expensive sundials were frequently adorned with intricate artwork and inscriptions. One celebrated sundial from the 13th century was covered in gold leaf and inlaid with precious stones marking the hours. Talk about medieval ostentation. Some even featured witty Latin proverbs about the transient nature of time, such as, "I mark only sunny hours." Medieval humor at its finest indeed. But here's something that truly underscores the importance of sundials. Medieval universities actually employed official sundial keepers. These fortunate individuals held the esteemed position of maintaining and adjusting the university sundial. They were essentially the IT department of the Middle Ages, except instead of resetting passwords, they were calculating solar angles and seasonal variations. There were even instructional manuals for sundials written in medieval times. One particularly amusing text from the 12th century begins with a phrase that translates to, "First, ensure your sundial is not positioned upside down." Apparently, even medieval tech support had to contend with user errors. The manual proceeds to provide increasingly complex instructions, likely inducing just as much frustration as contemporary IKEA furniture assembly guides. The ultimate status symbol in medieval times wasn't owning the most luxurious chariot or the most exquisite sword. It was possessing a remarkably accurate sundial. Wealthy merchants and nobles would commission increasingly elaborate designs, attempting to outdo one another with more sophisticated features. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of acquiring the latest iPhone model before anyone else. While sundials proved effective when the sun shone brightly, medieval people required a more dependable method for those overcast days and dark nights. This need led to the invention of another clever device, one that required no assistance from the sun whatsoever. When clouds obscured the sky and sundials became about as useful as a chocolate fireguard, medieval individuals turned to something slightly more reliable: water clocks, or as they were referred to by the sophisticated clepsydrus. The name originates from Greek terms meaning water thief, although frankly the only thing these instruments purloined was everyone's attention. The basic water clock functioned somewhat like an hourglass, but using water instead of sand. Drop by drop, water would trickle from one container to another, with markings indicating the passage of time. It sounds simple, but some medieval engineers took this fundamental concept and transformed it into the medieval equivalent of a Rube Goldberg machine. Consider the most renowned water clock constructed in the medieval era, the one created by Al-Jazari in 1206. This wasn't just a timepiece, it was a veritable robotic spectacle. It featured floating musicians, automated doors, and even mechanical peacocks that would unfurl their tails every hour. Talk about an impressive display. It's as if someone looked at a conventional clock and declared, "You know what this needs? Dancing puppets and self-propelled birds." Medieval water clocks came in diverse shapes and sizes. The smallest were portable instruments used by scholars and physicians, while the largest were massive public installations that occupied entire rooms. One particularly remarkable clock in a mosque in Damascus employed a series of containers that would sequentially tip over, like dominoes, throughout the day, initiating a chain reaction of timekeeping. Each container would trigger the next, and the entire system reset itself every 24 hours. Medieval physicians utilized small water clocks to measure patients' pulse rates. They would count heartbeats while a precise amount of water dripped through their portable clock. It was essentially a medieval fitness tracker, minus the step counter and irritating hourly reminders to stand up. Some physicians became so adept at this that they could diagnose illnesses based on the number of water drops equivalent to their patients' heartbeats. The noteworthy aspect of water clocks was their functionality during the night, unlike their sun-dependent counterparts. This was immensely significant for medieval monks who needed to rise for midnight prayers. Before water clocks, they had to rely on someone remaining awake to observe the stars. Talk about a demanding assignment. Brother John fell asleep during morning prayers again. Well, yes, Abbot, he was up all night gazing at the constellations. However, water clocks possess their own peculiarities. For instance, water flows at varying speeds depending on temperature, meaning these clocks could run fast in summer and slow in winter. Medieval clock keepers were constantly obliged to adjust the size of the water flow aperture to compensate. It was like having to recalibrate your digital clock, except instead of pressing buttons, you were meticulously manipulating tiny openings while attempting to avoid flooding the monastery. Some remarkably ingenious medieval engineers created water clocks equipped with automatic compensation systems. They incorporated additional chambers and floats designed to regulate the water flow based on changes in pressure. These individuals were essentially the Silicon Valley engineers of their time. Albeit instead of coding in Java, they were coding in H2O. One famous clock in Toledo even featured a system of weighted floats that automatically adjusted the water flow rate in response to temperature fluctuations. Medieval automation at its finest. The most sophisticated water clocks were capable of dividing the day into equal hours, a considerable advancement when most people still adhered to temporal hours whose length varied with the seasons. Imagine attempting to schedule a meeting when an hour could range anywhere from 45 to 75 minutes, depending on the time of year. Small wonder medieval people often seemed late. Records indicate that one particularly exasperated merchant documented met with the wool trader at the 3rd hour, which was apparently the 4th hour by his water clock, and definitively the 5th hour, according to the town sundial. One of the most significant challenges associated with water clocks was ensuring their operation in freezing conditions. Some medieval clock keepers, in a display of ingenuity, began using wine instead of water during winter months. This likely led to some rather interesting scenarios. Is the clock running fast, or have you been sampling the timekeeping fluid again? Records from one French monastery indicate they switched to diluted wine in winter, resulting in suspiciously frequent clock maintenance sessions. The upkeep of these clocks constituted a full-time job. Clock keepers were required to regularly clean the pipes, adjust the flow rate, and replenish the water supply. It was like being a hybrid of a plumber and a timekeeper. There are actual medieval records of clock keepers complaining about algae accumulating in the tubes. Apparently, even medieval job grievances included dealing with green slime. In some localities, water clock maintenance became a family legacy, with the expertise in keeping these temperamental timepieces operational being passed down through generations. These families functioned as the medieval equivalent of technical support, albeit instead of instructing people to reboot their devices, they were regulating water flows and clearing debris from the intake pipes. Some medieval water clocks achieved such remarkable accuracy that they only lost a few minutes per day. Quite impressive for technology that fundamentally relies on controlled dripping. Contrast that with inexpensive digital watches that somehow lose 5 minutes every time you look away, and one cannot help but admire medieval engineering. While water clocks were excellent for indoor timekeeping, medieval people also needed a means to track time while traveling, particularly at night. This necessity prompted them to look to the stars, utilizing instruments that would inspire awe in any contemporary astronomy enthusiast. If water clocks were the medieval smartphones, astrolabes were undoubtedly their GPS systems. Talk about a multi-purpose medieval gadget. These exquisite brass instruments could indicate the time, aid in navigation, measure the height of structures, and even forecast which stars would be visible on one's birthday. The term astrolabe literally translates to star taker, but medieval people might just as well have called it the impress your peers with your wealth and knowledge machine. Owning an astrolabe was akin to possessing the latest MacBook Pro and actually knowing how to fully utilize all its features. Medieval Islamic scholars utterly excelled in the realm of astrolabe craftsmanship. They produced devices of such precision that they could measure angles down to 1 minute of arc. That's 1/60th of a degree. To provide perspective that's comparable to being able to discern a penny from across a football field. The artisans who created these were essentially the medieval equivalents of NASA engineers. One celebrated craftsman, Al-Zarqali, fashioned an astrolabe so accurate it could chart the motion of planets throughout an entire year. There are actual court records detailing astrolabe makers suing each other for plagiarizing designs. One individual in 13th century Baghdad became so incensed about someone copying his unique star pointer design that he initiated legal proceedings. Medieval patent lawsuits. Some things remain constant, it seems. The court records reveal he prevailed in his case, and the copycat was ordered to compensate him in brass plates, which is somewhat analogous to receiving payment in printer ink today. The truly engaging aspect of astrolabes was the process of learning to use them. Medieval textbooks on astrolabes read much like those instruction manuals, where you're left wondering if they are genuinely serious or simply being facetious. One renowned manual commences with, "First, ensure you are holding it correctly, right side up. If the stars appear to be descending, you are doing it incorrectly." Medieval texts support at its most literal. Another manuscript included a troubleshooting guide with gems such as, "If your calculations indicate the sun should rise at midnight, you have likely made a mistake." However, acquiring an astrolabe was no simple matter. These instruments were expensive, costly enough to require selling your cow and perhaps your neighbor's cow too. A truly high-quality astrolabe could command a price equivalent to a small house. There's a humorous anecdote about a medieval scholar who pawned his entire library just to acquire one. His justification: "Books instruct you about the stars, but an astrolabe shows you where they are. Try employing that logic the next time you wish to purchase something extravagant." The most remarkable capability of medieval astrolabes was their ability to solve astronomical problems without requiring complex calculations. Desiring to know the time of tomorrow's sunrise, simply rotate the dial. Need to determine the duration until sunset? There's a setting for that. It was essentially a medieval computer, complete with its own version of applications. Different metal plates you could swap in for different latitudes. Some advanced models even featured interchangeable plates for various cities, rendering them the ideal tool for medieval travelers. Some particularly elaborate astrolabes even incorporated special functions for determining the most auspicious times for medical procedures. Medieval physicians believed certain astronomical alignments were more favorable for different treatments. "Apologies, I cannot extract that tooth today. Mars is in retrograde. Please return next week." At least it offered a more convincing excuse than, "The computer system is down." Records indicate some physicians would impose additional charges for consultations that included astrolabe readings, medieval upselling at its finest. The precision of these devices was astounding. A skilled user could determine the time within 15 minutes simply by observing the stars. Quite convenient when your water clock sprung a leak or your sundial was rendered useless by clouds. Medieval sailors employed them for navigating across oceans, although one would need to possess considerable bravery to entrust their life to a brass disc while sailing through a storm. One captain's log from 1375 reads, "Astrolabe indicates we are near Spain." If incorrect, the instrument maker is to blame. Some medieval scholars utilized them to calculate the times of sunrise and sunset for the entire year in advance. They would create remarkable tables that resembled ancient spreadsheets. One astronomer purportedly dedicated 3 years to these calculations for his city, only to relocate to a different latitude and be compelled to start over. Talk about a poor career move. But perhaps the most endearing quality of astrolabes was the deeply personal connection owners developed with them. Many surviving astrolabes bear small annotations scratched into them. Phrases like "check angle twice" or "works better after midnight." One even features, "If found, please return to A Modi. We'll trade knowledge of stars for safe return," engraved on the back. Another has tick marks counting the number of correct predictions it made, like a medieval scorekeeping device. The craftsmanship involved in creating astrolabes was incredible. Each one was hand-engraved with intricate patterns, star maps, and mathematical scales. Some were even adorned with portraits of famous astronomers or mythological figures. It was like possessing a work of art that also possessed the ability to inform you when to plant your crops or commence your journey. While astrolabes were exceptional for timekeeping at night, people required something simpler for indoor use, particularly during those long winter evenings. This need gave rise to another clever innovation, one that quite literally illuminated medieval timekeeping. Set aside that intricate astrolabe and procure a candle. We are about to explore medieval time tracking at its most inventive. Candle clocks served as the original nightlights of the Middle Ages, albeit instead of warding off imaginary monsters, they were utilized for tracking time. Mostly, the underlying principle was pure genius in its simplicity. Take a candle, mark it with intervals representing units of time, ignite it, and observe time literally melting away. These weren't your standard birthday candles, however. Medieval candle clocks were serious instruments, frequently standing as tall as a person and as thick as an arm. They were embedded with metal pins that would drop onto a metal plate below with a resonant ping as each hour elapsed. Talk about an alarm clock that offered no snooze function. Monks were particularly fond of these devices. They would designate special prayer candles that burned for precisely 4 hours, ideal for timing those middle-of-the-night prayer sessions. One monastery record from 1234 indicates they utilized over 2,000 timing candles in a single year. That's a considerable amount of wax. The monk responsible for ordering supplies must have engaged in some rather interesting conversations. "No, Brother Thomas, we cannot use those for the Christmas service. They are reserved for indicating time." Crafting these timing candles was an art form in itself. You couldn't simply grab any available candle and draw lines on it. The wax needed to be perfect, the wick precisely constructed, and don't even begin to discuss the importance of room temperature. Medieval candle makers who specialized in timing candles were akin to the Swiss watchmakers of their era, albeit with more burn marks on their aprons. Some even possessed secret recipes for their timing wax transmitted through generations, much like a family pizza dough recipe. Some elaborate candle clocks featured wax segments of different colors for various times of day. Red for morning prayers, white for midday, blue for evening. It was akin to a medieval mood lighting system. One particularly extravagant monastery had candles with scented wax sections. Lavender signified it was time for evening prayers, while pine indicated morning prayers were approaching. Medieval aromatherapy meets timekeeping. But the graduated candle clocks represent truly ingenious devices. These featured notches cut at angles down the side, so that as the candle burned downwards, it would burn faster or slower, depending on the time of day. It was medieval daylight saving time built directly into the candle. Although I can't help but ponder how many important meetings were missed while they were refining that design. One merchant's diary complains about arriving at a meeting at the third notch, only to discover everyone else had used different candles. Of course, these clocks were not without their flaws. A draft could cause them to burn unevenly, humidity could affect the burning rate, and don't even contemplate using them outdoors on a windy day. One medieval record recounts a merchant who attempted to use a candle clock during a stormy night journey. He ended up 3 towns away by morning because his candle burned twice as fast in the wind. Medieval GPS failures. Some clever individuals attempted to address these issues by enclosing their candle clocks in glass cases, but then they couldn't figure out how to light them. They ultimately had to break the glass. Medieval tech support at its finest. The repair bill likely exceeded the cost of a year's supply of candles. But the most innovative solution had to be the water clock/candle clock combination. Some genius realized that one could place a candle clock within a container that also housed a water clock as a backup. If the candle went out, the water clock still functioned. If the water clock leaked, the candle remained operational. It was medieval redundancy planning, though maintaining 2 types of clocks likely presented medieval timekeepers with twice the headaches. Pricing these timekeeping devices was complex. A quality timing candle could cost a day's wages. And those church bells, now there's a completely different narrative. They were poised to fundamentally alter how entire towns perceived and tracked time. Dong, there goes another hour. At least that's what medieval folk hoped as they heard the church bells chime. Before alarm clocks and smartphone notifications drove everyone to distraction, church bells served as the ultimate social communication platform of the Middle Ages. They did more than just indicate the time. They conveyed information to everyone. Did you know some medieval church bells were so powerful their sound carried for up to 6 miles? That's like receiving a notification you simply cannot ignore. And believe me, medieval people experienced their own version of notification fatigue. One disgruntled merchant recorded in 1342, "The bells ring so frequently my chickens have ceased laying eggs out of sheer spite." Each city possessed its own unique bell-ringing code, somewhat akin to a medieval Morse code. 2 brief rings might signal the time for morning prayer, while 3 prolonged rings could indicate the market was opening. The truly amusing aspect was when different churches engaged in bell wars. each endeavoring to ring their bells louder than the others. Medieval noise pollution was apparently a genuine concern. Some towns even found it necessary to enact laws regulating when bells could and could not be rung, the medieval equivalent of a noise ordinance. The responsibility of a bell ringer was no trivial matter. These individuals were required to ascend hundreds of steps multiple times daily in all types of weather simply to sound the bells at the correct hour. And we're not discussing small dinner bells here. Some medieval church bells weighed over 2 tons. One bell ringer's log from 1386 complained, "Pulled muscle in arm. Bell wins again. Will attempt with other arm tomorrow." The Angelus bell served as the medieval equivalent of a lunch break notification. It sounded at noon and everyone was expected to interrupt their activities and pray. Different social classes held varying relationships with the bells. Wealthier individuals could disregard certain bell signals because they possessed their own timekeeping devices, while ordinary people structured their entire day around them. It was like having a premium, ad-free subscription versus the free version laden with interruptions. One noble's diary entry reads, "The common folk rush about like startled chickens when the bells ring. We prefer our water clock, much more dignified." The bells didn't just mark time, they punctuated life events. Wedding bells, funeral bells, fire alarms, warning signals. Medieval people could discern what was happening in town simply by listening to the rhythm and pattern of the rings. One medieval writer noted, a man could be born, married, and buried to the sound of the same bells, assuming he didn't suffer deafness from all the ringing first. There were even specific tax bells that rang when tax collectors were present in town. Likely the least popular bell pattern in history. People developed all sorts of ingenious tricks to protect their ears, from stuffing them with wax to, believe it or not, ringing the bells with their teeth. Yes, they would bite down on a wooden rod connected to the bell rope. Talk about dedication to one's profession. Records show some bell ringers even passed down their hearing loss through generations, like a particularly unfortunate family legacy. The most impressive feat was orchestrating multiple bells across a city. Imagine attempting to synchronize all the church bells in town to ring at precisely the same moment without telephones or watches. One medieval chronicle recounts a time when all the bells in London rang simultaneously to celebrate a royal birth, except for one church that was behind schedule and rang their bells during the moment of silence that followed. Medieval awkwardness at its finest. Bell ringers were also required to be adept at forecasting weather. The sound of the bells varied in different atmospheric conditions, and skilled ringers could actually predict impending storms based on how their bells resonated. One bell ringer's diary from 1400 reads, "Bell sounds dull, rain is approaching. Best retrieve the laundry and my neighbor's sheep that continue to wander into our yard. Also, Ralph still owes me payment for last week's bell ringing lessons." The truly elaborate churches possessed something known as a carillon, essentially an entire orchestra of bells capable of playing actual melodies. Operating one was akin to playing a colossal musical instrument, except every discordant note could be heard across the entire town. No pressure. One apprentice bell ringer wrote, attempted to play a Maria. Townspeople claim it sounded more like angry geese. Back to practicing. Master says I can try again when the birds cease fleeing in terror. While the bells synchronized communities with daily routines, people still needed ways to track nature's grander patterns. This is where medieval folk turned to something even more reliable than bronze bells, the natural world itself. As it turns out, Mother Nature maintained a surprisingly consistent schedule when it came to tracking time, and medieval people were experts at interpreting her signals. Consider medieval farmers, for instance. They could ascertain the time of year simply by observing which flowers emerged in their fields. Dandelions functioned like little yellow alarm clocks announcing, "Hey, it's time to commence spring planting." These natural timekeepers were so dependable that farmers actually named certain weeks after the flowers that blossomed then. Daffodil Week wasn't merely an aesthetically pleasing name. It signified, get your gardening tools ready. This system was so intricate that different regions developed their own localized flower calendars based on indigenous blooming patterns. And it's truly fascinating how medieval people recognized that certain flowers opened and closed at specific times of the day. They referred to this phenomenon as the flower clock. Morning glories predictably bloomed at dawn, while evening primrose unfolded precisely as the sun was setting. One particularly irritable medieval gardener recorded in his journal, "The marigolds are lagging behind again. Cannot trust French flowers to keep accurate English time. Intending to replant with good British stock next spring." Animals were also integral components of this natural timepiece. Medieval farmers knew it was approximately 3 a.m. when their roosters initiated their first crow, although apparently medieval roosters were not always the most reliable alarm clocks. One farmer's diary from 1389 complains, "Rooster overslept again. Suspecting he was up late with the neighbor's hens. Third time this week. Considering rooster soup for Sunday dinner. Must procure a replacement with better timekeeping discipline and less inclination for social engagements." Here's a fact that might pique your interest. Medieval beekeepers utilized their bees to ascertain the time. They observed that different flowers produced nectar at specific times of day, and bees would adjust their flight patterns accordingly. Early morning bees frequented the clover fields, while midday found them heading towards the dandelions. One beekeeper's record shows he could determine the time within 30 minutes solely by observing which flowers his bees were visiting. Talk about a sweet way to track time. Some beekeepers became so proficient at this they could even forecast rain by observing their bees' behavior. A particularly detailed beekeeper's journal from 1356 meticulously maps out the daily schedule of his hives with remarkable precision. Even cows participated in the timekeeping process. Medieval farmers noticed their cows would naturally begin their return to the barn for milking at almost precisely the same time each day. Their regularity was so consistent you could calibrate your sundial by them. Although, one medieval dairy record notes, cows arrived an hour late today, attribute it to the exceptionally flavorful grass in the North Field. Must remember to implement pasture rotation based on punctuality rather than grass quality. The shifting seasons functioned as nature's calendar application. Medieval people tracked time through what they termed agricultural moments, key events in the farming year that occurred with predictable regularity. The first call of the cuckoo signaled the commencement of spring planting. The arrival of swallows indicated it was time for sheep shearing. One shepherd's notes read, "Birds are late this year. Sheep appear smugly woolen," beginning to suspect they are disseminating rumors about wolf sightings to delay shearing. Discovered mysterious claw marks on the barn door this morning. Clearly, sheep are retaliating. They even possessed methods for measuring shorter time intervals using plants. Water lilies were particularly effective for this purpose. They would open their flowers for precisely 3 hours each morning. Medieval monks actually cultivated them in their garden ponds to assist in timing their morning prayers. However, there's an amusing anecdote about one monastery where all the water lilies bloomed at different times because someone had planted them facing different directions. The head gardener's note reads, "Brother Thomas maintains the flowers are fine. We are merely in different time zones." Suspecting he has been sampling too much communion wine, have reassigned him to bell-ringing duty instead. At least bells do not grow in the wrong direction. Some of these natural timekeepers were remarkably accurate. Studies have shown that certain medieval farming schedules based entirely on natural indicators only varied by approximately 2 days over a span of 100 years. That's more precise than some contemporary weather forecasts. Medieval farmers could predict the onset of spring within a 3-day window simply by observing which birds returned and when certain trees began budding. An agricultural manual from 1401 lists over 400 different natural signs employed for timing various farming activities. Medieval people also utilized the biological rhythms of others to keep track of time. They recognized that most individuals experienced hunger around the same time each day, so hunger time evolved into a recognized unit of measurement. "Meet me at hunger time" was a perfectly standard way to schedule lunch. Although one medieval cook complained, "Lord Geoffrey's hunger time occurs 3 times before everyone else's," makes meal planning rather challenging, beginning to suspect he is merely using it as an excuse to raid the pantry. Have commenced concealing the good cheese behind the pickled herrings. But nature didn't solely assist medieval people in tracking hours and seasons. It also helped them anticipate approaching danger. Birds suddenly falling silent often signaled an impending storm, while cows lying down in the field meant rain was on the way. One farmer wrote, "When the sheep huddle together, either rain is coming or the neighbor's dog is loose again. Usually both. Today they are huddled and looking guilty, suspecting they have consumed the vegetable garden again. Wife suggests we initiate a betting pool on which excuse is correct this time." Speaking of anticipating events, medieval communities needed methods to track time that didn't necessitate constantly observing flowers. This is where they turned to specially trained experts. Forget Doctor Who, medieval professional timekeepers were the true Time Lords. They held a single crucial responsibility, ensuring everyone in town knew the time. Sounds straightforward, right? Not when your most reliable tools might include a leaky water clock or a perpetually sleepy rooster. These individuals went by various titles: horologists, time criers, bell ringers, or, as one disgruntled medieval document puts it, those noisy fellows who won't let anyone sleep past dawn. It was a high-pressure profession, quite literally in the case of water clock keepers, who were obliged to maintain the correct water pressure throughout the day, adjusting the flow as temperatures changed and clearing out debris that could disrupt their measurements. The most skilled timekeepers were revered like celebrities in their communities. One timekeeper in York received a higher salary than the town's doctor. Although, to be fair, the doctor's patients only complained if they died, whereas everyone complained if dinner was served late. Records indicate one timekeeper was awarded a bonus of 2 chickens and a wheel of cheese for maintaining accuracy for a solid month. The town records note, worth every bird and bite, no one has been late to church for 4 whole weeks, considering adding a goose if he can maintain this standard through winter. But being a professional timekeeper wasn't solely about counting hours. These individuals had to be part mathematician, part astronomer, and part diplomat. Try informing an important merchant he's late for a meeting when his own personal sundial, which he installed incorrectly, insists he's early. One timekeeper's diary entry reads, "Lord William maintains it is not time for his taxes because his rooster has not crowed. Rooster mysteriously ceased crowing 3 weeks ago. Suspicious. Discovered feathers in his kitchen yesterday. Feigning ignorance. Will append an extra hour to his tax time as compensation for attempted time fraud." Town criers faced particularly challenging conditions. They were required to walk around announcing the hour every hour in all types of weather. One medieval record documents a crier who caught a cold, and his voice became so hoarse that everyone believed it was 3 hours later than it actually was. The entry reads, "John's voice finally recovered. Town schedule is back to normal. Baker, particularly relieved, was weary of serving lunch at breakfast time. Tavern keeper, less pleased, was enjoying the extra evening hours. Have suggested John practices calls before each round to prevent future confusion." Some towns maintain multiple timekeepers who were expected to synchronize with one another. You can well imagine how smoothly that operated. The profession came with some rather peculiar responsibilities as well. In some towns, timekeepers were obliged to track beer time, the officially sanctioned hours during which taverns were permitted to serve drinks. This led to some creative conflict resolution. One record notes, "The tavern owner claims it is not closing time because his cat has not completed its evening ablutions yet. Timekeeper responded by introducing 3 other cats who all agreed it was definitively past closing. Dispute ended when all the cats spotted a mouse and promptly vacated the premises. Have resolved to rely on sundials and water clocks, less prone to chasing mice." Here's a surprising fact. Some medieval timekeepers were held in such high regard that they possessed the legal authority to awaken anyone in town, including nobility. One account recounts a timekeeper who routinely tossed pebbles at the local lord's window to rouse him for morning prayers. The lord was powerless to complain, as this was technically part of the timekeeper's official duties. Talk about job security. The same account mentions the lord attempting to bribe the timekeeper with gold to lose track of time during dawn prayers. It was unsuccessful. The timekeeper's retort, "Time waits for no man, my lord, not even one with a heavy purse." But perhaps the most taxing aspect was having to adjust everyone's perception of time when the seasons changed. Medieval hours were not fixed in length like ours. Their duration fluctuated with the amount of daylight. A summer hour could be considerably longer than a winter hour. One timekeeper wrote, "Attempted to explain to the baker why his bread-making hour is shorter now. He responded by throwing a loaf at me. At least it wasn't fully baked this time. Have suggested he count by loaves instead of hours. He is contemplating the proposal." Meanwhile, the miller insists his grinding hours should maintain the same length all year. Explain that is not how the sun operates, he remains unconvinced. The truly dedicated timekeepers meticulously documented their methods. Some of these records survive to this day and are remarkably insightful. One from 1392 includes the note, "For accurate morning time, count the baker's snores. When they cease, it is dawn, unless it is Sunday. He sleeps in and disrupts the entire system. Have commenced compensating his apprentice to awaken him. Cost, 1 small pie per week. Worth it. Must remember to specify the filling next time. The apprentice claims rhubarb qualifies as fruit." And when timekeepers made errors, those anecdotes are legendary. Records from one town indicate they celebrated New Year's Eve twice in 1387 because the timekeeper lost track of the days. Instead of admitting his mistake, he persuaded everyone that the first celebration was actually for Old Year's Eve, and thereby initiated a new tradition. The town found it so enjoyable they continued the practice for years until a new timekeeper arrived and was thoroughly confused about the rationale for 2 New Year's celebrations. The tradition only ceased when someone finally performed the necessary calculations and realized they were gradually shifting the entire calendar year backward. Yet while these dedicated timekeepers grappled with the challenge of informing people when to break for lunch, medieval society as a whole achieved some truly remarkable feats of coordination. Consider the construction of cathedrals, for example. These were not simply large religious structures, they were immense construction projects that spanned decades to complete. And somehow they managed to synchronize hundreds of workers without the aid of a single digital project management tool. Instead, they employed a fascinating system involving songs. Yes, songs. Workers would time their lifting and moving of heavy stones to specific chants and rhythmic patterns. One construction record from 1347 notes, "Master Mason insists workers sing slower. Stones are moving too quickly, causing wall alignment issues." Choir master was offended. Architectural dispute escalated into a musical crisis. Military timing was even more impressive. Medieval armies were capable of coordinating attacks across vast distances using a combination of flags, horns, and prearranged signals. One battle account describes how an army timed their attack based on when a specific bird typically commenced its morning song. The commander's log reads, "Birds sang late today. Entire battle plan was delayed. Note for future, secure a backup bird." They even developed a sophisticated system of beacon fires that could transmit messages across hundreds of miles in just a few hours. Medieval builders could predict with considerable accuracy how long it would take for mortar to dry under varying weather conditions. They didn't possess humidity meters or temperature gauges. They relied solely on experience and meticulous observation. One builder's manual contains this gem. If a cat can walk on the mortar without sinking, it is ready for the next layer. If a cat refuses to walk on it, find a braver cat. Their shipping coordination was equally remarkable. Ports would schedule dozens of ships arriving and departing using nothing more than tide tables and weather patterns. One harbor master's log from 1389 reveals they successfully managed 47 ships in a single day, using only the height of the waves and the position of seabirds as timing indicators. Although there is one amusing entry. 3 ships arrived early, attributed it to enthusiastic wind, suspecting they simply cannot interpret tide markers. Medieval universities also maintained their own impressive timing systems. Must coordinate with the bell ringer and the tavern keeper. But perhaps the most extraordinary success story was their ability to brew beer with surprisingly consistent timing. Without thermometers or precise clocks, medieval brewers could time their brewing stages perfectly using only touch, sight, and sound. One brewery record states, when the master brewer's bald head ceases steaming when he bends over the vat, it is ready for the next stage. Hey, whatever method works. All these achievements stem from something we seem to have somewhat diminished today: the capacity to interpret and work in harmony with nature's intrinsic rhythms. While we are all fixated on our phones, medieval individuals were observing the sky, the vegetation, and the animals surrounding them. Granted, they might not have been able to tell you it was precisely 3:47 p.m., but they could inform you exactly when the tide would turn, when a storm was imminent, and when the bread would be perfectly baked. Perhaps they were onto something with their more adaptable approach to time. After all, their cathedrals still stand. Their trade routes flourished for centuries, and their brewing recipes are still utilized today. Not a bad legacy for people who considered a quarter past sunrise a sufficiently precise time for a meeting.